Welcome to the deep dive. Something's been gnawing at me lately. This strange dance we're all doing with freedom in our, well, super connected lives. It feels like a real paradox, doesn't it?
It does.
Are we actually more free with all this digital stuff, or are we just kind of operating within a new, maybe more subtle set of rules?
It's a really fascinating question. And, while the digital world feels completely new, this underlying tension between what we desire and what civilization demands, that's ancient.
Right.
You could look at Freud's core ideas, for
Yeah.
instance. He basically saw civilization as this process of suppressing our most primal instincts. What he called eros, the life drive, connection, creation, and this thanatos, the drive towards, well, destruction or stillness.
Eros and Thanatos, before the internet, obviously.
Long before. But that framework, it offers a surprisingly relevant lens for looking at what's happening right now.
Okay, let's dig into that then. This illusion of freedom. Because when I'm on social media, liking something, commenting, sharing, it feels like me. It feels like I'm expressing myself, making a choice.
And that feeling is powerful.
Yeah.
But are those actions truly as autonomous as they seem? That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Think about the possibility that these seemingly personal expressions are actually part of a much bigger system, an almost invisible system of influence.
Yeah, so.
Well, that subtle craving for validation, the likes, the shares, the carefully built images we project online, are they, authentic reflections? Or are they more like performances, tailored for an audience we can't even fully see?
Like we're constantly curating ourselves for some digital stage. And Freud's idea, repression being necessary for civilization.
Yeah.
How does that connect? Are we sacrificing something real just to fit into this online society?
That's precisely the parallel. Freud argued that civilization demands a trade-off, right?
Yeah.
We give up some immediate gratification, some raw impulses, and in return, we get order, stability. In our digital age, maybe this shows up in how meticulously we craft our online identities. We push down the bits that seem messy or undesirable or just don't fit the mold. We present this polished, often idealized version instead.
But why? What's driving that constant self-editing? Is it just external pressure? Like fear of being judged online? Or is there something deeper going on psychologically?
Well, that's getting to the heart of it. External pressure, the desire to belong, to be accepted, that's definitely part of it, no doubt.
Sure.
But there might also be other psychological needs being met. Maybe
Okay.
carefully managing our online self gives us a sense of control in what feels like a chaotic digital space. Or perhaps it's even a way to sort of try on different identities in a place where the consequences feel less immediate.
That makes a certain kind of sense. And then you layer on the algorithms, these invisible engines deciding what we see, what we hear. It feels like they're constantly nudging us.
They absolutely are. I mean, social media algorithms are built to maximize engagement. That's their job.
Right. Keep you scrolling.
Exactly. And often, the easiest way to do that is by showing you things that align with what's already popular, with existing trends, which can inadvertently, perhaps, create these echo chambers. So viewpoints that are a bit different, less conventional, they get pushed to the margins, all within this space that pretends to offer limitless expression.
So even when I think I'm exploring freely, I might just be walking down paths laid out by code. Is there any real agency left then? Can we genuinely express who we are despite all that?
That is the central tension, isn't it? These structures, the algorithms, they undeniably exert influence, a powerful one. But people aren't entirely passive. We're not just puppets.
All right.
There are always ways to push against the grain,
Right.
to find little pockets for genuine expression, maybe build communities around niche interests. The real question is how conscious we are when we do that, how intentional.
You mentioned Freud and morality earlier, not as some divine thing, but emerging from society's need for order. How have our sources of morality shifted now in this digital landscape?
Well, what's really striking is the move away from, let's say, traditional anchors, like established institutions, religious doctrines, even formal legal systems sometimes, and towards more fluid, often much less transparent sources, like online influencers, or the very algorithms we were just talking about. These become the new arbiters, subtly shaping our ideas of right and wrong, what's acceptable, what's not, often in ways we don't even notice.
And the implications of that shift, having algorithms and, Instagram stars shaping our moral compass, that feels a bit shaky. What are the upsides, if any, And the downsides seem pretty clear.
It's definitely precarious. Potential benefits. I suppose you could argue for a faster spread of certain positive values sometimes, or maybe a shared understanding within specific online groups. But the downsides are serious. Algorithms can bake in and amplify biases. Influencers might chase popularity over ethics.
Mm-hmm.
And the lack of clear accountability. It raises huge questions about manipulation, about the erosion of independent critical thinking.
It really feels like it contributes to this, I don't know, this moral schizophrenia you sometimes see. On the one hand, it seems like anything goes online, total permissiveness. But on the other, there's this intense pressure to conform. Cancel culture feels like the end point of that.
Exactly that. We live in these spaces where almost anything can be shown or said, theoretically. Yet the fear of public shaming, of social exile being canceled, creates this incredibly powerful undercurrent of enforced conformity. And that fear, it acts as a new kind of repression. Maybe more insidious because it's not always overt. It shapes not just what we say out loud, but maybe even what we allow ourselves to think.
Is this new repression really different from older forms of social control? Or are the psychological effects basically the same, just with new tools?
That's a really critical question. The mechanisms are different, obviously. Online shaming versus, say, historical forms of punishment. But the psychological impact, fear of exclusion, internalizing norms, there are probably deep similarities. However, the speed, the reach, the permanence of digital shaming, and the anonymity factor, that could definitely create unique psychological burdens, something new we're grappling with.
And these repressed desires, Freud's idea was they don't just disappear, right? They pop back up, but distorted. Things like cyberbullying or online pornography seem like really stark digital examples of that.
It's insightful to view them through that lens. Cyberbullying as perhaps a displaced outlet for suppressed aggression. Online porn as a kind of sanitized, commodified version of sexuality, of eros.
Sanitized, yeah.
And while these digital spaces might offer a release valve of sorts, the crucial question is, do they actually resolve the underlying tensions? Or do they just provide temporary, maybe ultimately unsatisfying substitutes for more authentic expression or connection?
Like putting a bandage on a deeper wound. And this blurring you mentioned between personal and collective repression, the constant drive for productivity, for self-optimization, that really hit home for me.
Yes, that relentless striving for self-improvement, often fueled by comparing ourselves on social media, by the pressures of a hyper-competitive world. You can see that as both individual anxiety and a reflection of the broader demands of, say, late capitalism.
We internalize it.
We absolutely internalize this command to constantly optimize, to become, more productive human doings rather than just human beings.
So what gets lost then? When we're so focused on optimizing on output, what happens to our inner lives, our actual sense of self?
That raises a really profound point about the value we place on just being, on introspection. The constant focus on external validation, on measurable results, it can completely crowd out the space needed for self-reflection, for wrestling with our deeper needs, our contradictions, for cultivating a rich inner life.
It keeps circling back to this double-edged quality of modern life, the promise of liberation, but then these new forms of control. Foucault's ideas about power working through normalization seem really relevant.
Absolutely. Modern power often isn't about brute force, is it? It's about these subtle mechanisms that shape our desires, our behaviors, making them feel natural, even self-chosen. Normalization. And Freud's idea of progress being this ongoing negotiation between our instincts and society's demands fits right in. But as you said, digital tech has just thrown this negotiation into hyperdrive. It's accelerated everything, creating this rapid feedback loop of maybe instant gratification followed by this lingering dissatisfaction.
And that relentless pace, it leaves almost no room to actually process these contradictions, does it? We just get swept along.
Exactly. The constant bombardment of stimuli, the pressure to stay connected 24/7.
Yeah.
It can seriously hamper our ability to do that deep introspective work, to really grapple with the messy, complex reality of our desires versus the constraints we live under.
So let's go deeper into those foundational drives you mentioned earlier, eros and thanatos. Freud saw them as these fundamental conflicting forces shaping everything, not just us as individuals, but whole cultures. Civilization then becomes this mechanism for channeling them, right? But it sounds like a really delicate balancing act.
It is. And what's truly fascinating is looking at how different cultures throughout history have come up with these incredibly intricate systems, rituals, myths, laws, art, all essentially attempts to manage and redirect the raw energy of both eros and thanatos, to channel them into forms that are, socially acceptable or even productive.
Okay, so take pornography in the digital age. You described it as a form of controlled eros. It seems like this wide open space, but maybe it's more about containment.
That's one way to look at it, yes. While it seems to offer limitless sexual freedom, pornography, especially in its easily accessible commodified online form, can evidently end up limiting or even distorting our experience of eros by reducing intimacy, desire, connection, potentially down to a product for consumption. It can risk fostering emotional detachment, maybe even creating a craving for authentic connection that it just can't satisfy.
Right. It's a curated fantasy that might paradoxically make real intimacy harder. Okay, what about Thanatos? The death drive, aggression. How does that get redirected historically and now digitally?
Well, historically, you see it channeled through things like legal systems punishing violence, defining justice. Also through cultural narratives, stories of heroism, sacrifice, war, providing socially sanctioned outlets for aggression or destructive impulses.
Okay.
In the digital world, we see flickers of it maybe in things like cyberbullying or even the aggression in some online gaming communities. The critical question there, always, is whether these digital outlets are genuinely harmless releases or if they risk reinforcing negative cycles of behavior.
It's tricky, isn't it? Could those digital spaces, sometimes at least, just be harmless ways to blow off steam? Maybe even build certain kinds of communities, even if they seem a bit aggressive from the outside.
That's a really important nuance. It's probably not all one thing. While the potential for harm is definitely there, some digital interactions might offer a form of catharsis or a sense of belonging for people who maybe struggle with expressing those impulses elsewhere. The key is avoiding overly simple judgments, I think.
Right. And the superego, that inner critic, the voice of authority we internalize, in our world, the always-on hyper-compared world, does that just get louder, amplified by all the external pressure?
Or absolutely. The constant exposure to seemingly perfect lives online, the chase for likes and followers, the pervasive culture of comparison, it all feeds into what can become a very harsh, very unforgiving superego. That inner critic is constantly measuring us against these often impossible standards, fueling feelings of inadequacy, anxiety, you name it.
So where does that modern superego even come from? Are influencers and online communities effectively becoming the new authority figures whose voices we internalize?
That's a really insightful way to put it. In a world where maybe traditional authority figures have less sway for some people, yes, influencers, online gurus, even dominant community norms can absolutely become powerful sources for our internalized sense of what's right, wrong, desirable, or shameful. We absorb their values, often unconsciously.
Okay, and when these desires we've repressed can't get out directly, Freud talked about sublimation, channeling them into something socially acceptable, like art or science. What are the modern versions, and are they always good?
Modern sublimation definitely exists. Think about intense dedication to a career, maybe extreme fitness pursuits, certain kinds of passionate activism online. But as you hinted, are they always benign? Not necessarily.
Right.
Obsessive workaholism, for example, could be sublimation taken too far, becoming destructive. Or the intense focus on achieving a certain physical perfection in fitness culture. It might mask deep insecurities, or reinforce pretty problematic cultural ideas about worth being tied to appearance.
So even our healthy outlets might be tangled up with these deeper, unresolved things.
Wow. You mentioned historical examples before, like Victorian repression or the Protestant work ethic. How did those shape culture through suppressed desires?
Well, the Victorian era, with its strict social rules, especially around sexuality, created this culture that was outwardly very proper, but underneath simmering with hidden desires. These found expression indirectly in art, literature, coded language, maybe even neurosis.
Okay.
The Protestant work ethic, linking hard work and worldly success to signs of divine favor, effectively channeled ambition, and maybe even anxiety about salvation into intense economic activity. It fundamentally shaped capitalism, but maybe at the cost of devaluing leisure or contemplation or other parts of being human.
And now we have consumer culture, constantly showing us things we need, promising fulfillment, but it never quite lasts, does it?
Yeah.
Feels like a similar pattern of wanting, getting, then wanting again. Exactly. Consumer culture thrives on manufacturing a sense of lack. It tells you constantly that the next purchase, the next experience, that's the thing that will finally make you happy, complete.
Yeah.
It creates this perpetual cycle. Desire, brief satisfaction upon acquiring something, then the desire just latches onto something new. It mirrors that dynamic of repressed desires, always seeking an outlet, finding temporary fixes, but never true resolution.
It feels like we end up losing ourselves in this chase for belonging, making these unconscious sacrifices just to fit the mold. And now, digitally, with our real selves versus our online selves, that fragmentation feels even more intense.
It really does. The pressure to maintain different personas for different online spaces, the potential gap between who we present ourselves as online and who we feel we are offline, that can lead to a profound sense of fragmentation, yeah? A feeling of not having a solid integrated core self.
So how does anyone even start to navigate that? How do you cultivate a more whole sense of self when you're split across the digital and physical?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? It probably starts with cultivating much more self-awareness, really consciously thinking about why we do what we do online, what motivates those posts, those curated images, and then maybe prioritizing authentic connections and experiences in the physical world, setting deliberate boundaries with technology, actively resisting that constant pressure to perform or compare. It's hard work.
It sounds incredibly hard, which brings us back to that really unsettling core of Freud's ideas. That the very things holding civilization together might also be caging us. Are these subtle modern controls, the expectations, the algorithms, just a new kind of prison? More comfortable maybe, but still a prison.
Well, before we just call it a prison, it's crucial to think about the trade-offs.
Yeah.
What do we get from this captivity? These systems do provide benefits.
Yeah.
Social order, a sense of connection, even sometimes shallow, access to information, entertainment. The critical question is about balance. Has the scale tipped too far towards control, towards constraint, at the expense of genuine individual freedom and well-being?
And it feels like civilization, especially now, doesn't just ask for obedience, but for a kind of erasure of individuality. A smoothing out of the rough edges to fit in. Social media curation seems like the ultimate example. What's actually left underneath that perfect online persona?
That is the deep and maybe uncomfortable question to ask yourself. When so much energy goes into building and maintaining that idealized online self, do we lose touch with our authentic self? The messy, imperfect, contradictory parts that make us human. What might be left is just the mask, hiding vulnerabilities, unmet needs, maybe even our true desires.
But is there any room for realness in those spaces? Can you push back? Can you be authentic within that curated world?
I think so, yes. While the pressure to conform is immense, people do find ways. They subvert expectations, share vulnerabilities, build genuine connections despite the platform's design. But it usually requires a conscious choice, a decision to value authenticity over likes, real connection over performance.
It's a constant battle, it sounds like. And those desires we suppress, they don't just evaporate, they leak out, right? As negative feelings, maybe addictions, maybe even creatively, always reminding us of what's been pushed down.
Exactly. Unacknowledged, unexpressed desires and impulses tend to surface somehow, often. As anxiety, depression, anger, or through compulsive behaviors. Even creative work, as we discussed with sublimation, can carry the energy of those suppressed parts. There's this constant internal tension.
And what does that do to us collectively? If huge numbers of people are carrying around this unacknowledged repression, how does that shape society, our culture?
Widespread unacknowledged repression could contribute to a kind of collective malaise, couldn't it? Manifesting as pervasive social anxiety, maybe cultural trends that lean heavily into escapism or superficiality, perhaps even political polarization as those underlying frustrations and fears get projected outwards onto scapegoats.
You mentioned the good stuff born from sublimation too, art, science. Civilization is built on channeling those drives, on sacrifice. But the cost, like Freud said, is neurosis. This pervasive modern unease, the anxiety, depression, burnout everywhere. Is that just the unavoidable price tag?
That's the profoundly unsettling insight Freud offered, yes. Civilization brings incredible achievements, immense progress, but it comes at a psychological cost. The ongoing pressure to deny fundamental parts of ourselves, to conform. It generates this background hum of discontent, of neurosis. The vital question for us now is, can we find healthier ways to manage this inherent conflict? Or is this level of distress simply the price of admission to modern life?
And technology, which we hoped would liberate us, seems in many ways to have become this incredibly efficient instrument of control. Tracking us, monitoring us, subtly shaping our thoughts. We're hyper-connected, yet people report feeling more isolated than ever, drowning in data but starving for real understanding.
Precisely. That's the core paradox of our current technological moment. It offers connection on an unprecedented scale, instant access to information, but simultaneously creates powerful new tools for surveillance, manipulation, and the potential erosion of deep thought and genuine human connection.
So how do we even begin to use these tools more mindfully? How do we resist the control aspect and reclaim some of that promised liberation?
It demands conscious, critical engagement. It means setting boundaries, real ones. It means choosing mindful consumption over passive scrolling, actively cultivating real-world connections, questioning the algorithmic feeds, being aware of how these platforms are designed to capture our attention and shape our behavior. It requires effort.
It really feels like the answer isn't about finding some magic solution to resolve the tension between freedom and constraint. Maybe it's more about learning to live within that tension, to actually confront the contradictions head on. That sounds incredibly difficult.
It is difficult, profoundly so. But perhaps it's precisely in that confrontation, in the willingness to question the narratives we've internalized, the values we've accepted without scrutiny, that we find the path towards greater self-knowledge. And maybe, just maybe, a more authentic way of being.
So the structures that hold us together can also subtly hold us back. Progress always involves trade-offs. As you go about your day, maybe reflect on your own digital life. Where do you feel truly free? And where do you sense that subtle pull of constraint, maybe even unconsciously? Think about the self you present online. Is it the real you or a performance? And what unseen forces might be shaping your thoughts, your desires, your actions? Perhaps real understanding and the potential for change starts right there, in that discomfort, in the willingness to sit with the complexities. Maybe embracing our contradictions is the closest we get to finding ourselves in this incredibly intricate modern world.